Every Fortune 500 company has a DEI office, DEI officers, some sort of DEI programs in place. Something that I discuss in my book is that it could also be going to union busters. They will help a company do some union busting, but at the same time, they'll also offer them a DEI package.
Do you get a discount?
Exactly.
If you get both?
If you bundle the two services. Even if you don't buy all of that and you think, corporations, no, it was co-optation. Why was it so easy for them to hijack or to co-opt this supposedly grassroots movement? DEIB, sometimes just belonging. I've seen JEDI, J-E-D-I, justice.
Like Star Wars?
Listen, Josh, I'm only telling you what I've seen.
Did woke help to put Trump in office? Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Jennifer Pan, a writer whose work has appeared in The Nation, Dissent, The Atlantic, and Damage magazine. She was formerly a host of The Jacobin Show and a staff writer at The New Republic. She is the author of Selling Social Justice, out now from Verso Books. I think there's a hazard that if we don't talk about this, our political opponents definitely will.
Yeah.
And there are penalties for having these conversations. You get either directly called out, you get punished in the workplace, you get attacked on social media. If you don't want to implement DEI everywhere,
yes.
What do you have as a proposal? What would you prefer instead?
Universal social democratic programs. So healthcare for all, a jobs guarantee, jobs for all, college for all, education for all. It sounds boring because it is. It's just really hard to implement.
Why would we assume that universal policies would benefit Black people, for example?
It's basically the only thing that ever has. And that's not to say that discrimination or anti-discrimination law is not important. Clearly it is. But if you think about the period during which Black people saw the most upward mobility, during which the wage differential between Black and white workers shrank the most, it's during this period that we now call the Great Compression, right? When the economic fortunes of all Americans kind of started to converge. That's the period between 1940 and 1970, roughly. So, from the New Deal and post-war period up until the 70s, aka the dawn of neoliberalism. What's, I think, interesting about that time period is that a large part of it occurs before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right?
Right.
So, technically still under the legal Jim Crow regime, Black people still saw tremendous economic gains, tremendous upward mobility because the economic floor was rising for everybody. Now, of course, I have to add the caveat that Black people's fortunes did not rise as high as white people's fortunes during that time, because there was obviously still racism and discrimination, which luckily were addressed to some degree in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But to me, that's kind of incredible, right? Like under a period of pretty horrific racial repression, you still see these economic gains. So to me, that's kind of the smoking gun. The social democratic reforms seem to do a lot. The anti-discrimination, necessary but not sufficient.
There's an example that always comes to mind. A friend of mine moved to Europe a few years ago for a job. And many of these European countries, we think of them as being very enlightened. And they're fucking racist as shit.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We were out at a bar and there's a little sculpture, a figurine of a saxophone player that is just the most grotesque caricature of a Black person you can imagine. And we were just sitting there having a few drinks, and it probably takes me like an hour to notice that this thing is in the background. There's just some decoration in the bar. I'm like, wait, what the fuck? Like they've got this thing out here, and he's like, oh yeah, everybody here is like super racist. But that country has a national health service. Mm-hmm. The average life expectancy of a Black person in this unnamed European country, 12 years longer than the United States.
Mm-hmm. Not surprised. Yeah.
That's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. What you would do to have another 12 years with your loved one.
Yeah.
Like the material cost of this hyper-focus on the interpersonal racism rather than the redistribution of material wealth causes people to die sooner.
Right.
Just to underline what is really at stake in these conversations.
Yeah. And that is another reason why these kind of boring, universal social democratic reforms, I think, are much more important than anti-racism or, anti-discrimination because of exactly what you said. If you think about the composition of the working class, Black and brown people are disproportionately represented within the working class. So any universal program that will help the working class.
No, I'm sorry. The working class is all white men. I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Right, yeah. We did just go over that. It's all white men in hard hats.
Yes, every single one of them. Although a few years ago, when people were talking about, we just mentioned the New Deal.
Yeah.
We were told that the New Deal is racist.
Yes.
Why do we want another one? Why do we want another one?
The New Deal was not racist. The New Deal, okay, the New Deal was obviously not perfect or free from discrimination, but there is a lot of, I think, just fake history and outright distortion that goes on when people talk about the New Deal. Something that you'll hear a lot is that, oh, the New Deal was racist because, yes, it gave us Social Security, but domestic and agricultural workers who were predominantly Black were actually cut out of the Social Security protections, and that was because the Southern Democrats were racist and they were part of the New Deal coalition. So you see, the New Deal is racist because most Black people were cut out of Social Security. So that isn't actually true. It is true that domestic and agricultural workers were cut out of Social Security. That was partially pressure from the Southern Democrats. But it was also pressure from the business lobbies, which thought that it would be too cumbersome to, have these kind of contingent and precarious workforces pay into Social Security and then have the employers kind of figure out exactly what their hours were, and what exactly they owed to Social Security. So it was a lot of pressure from the business lobbies as well. And I also want to point out that while domestic and agricultural workers were disproportionately Black, they were predominantly white. So 75% of agricultural workers under the New Deal were white. So, if the plan was to lock Black people out of Social Security by carving these workers, 75% of them are white. That's a lot of collateral damage for a program that's supposed to be white supremacy.
This period you mentioned earlier, the Great Compression, what were the years in which we calculate that again?
Roughly 1940 to 1970.
1940 to 1970. People will argue that neoliberalism begins around 1972, or maybe 1972 is where wages and productivity become divergent.
Right.
What starts to happen to the distribution of wealth post-72?
It's insane. It basically what happens, this is a story that I think is pretty well known, the economic gains start going pretty much almost entirely to the top 1%, where everybody else is left to divide the crumbs. I think it was the Rand Corporation that had a kind of striking estimate that over the neoliberal era, basically, between the end of the late 70s to basically 2020, they have this estimate that $50 trillion was redistributed from the working class upward to the upper class, just through, tax write-offs, neoliberal fiscal policy, which, makes it so that if you're rich or if you're a corporation, you don't have to pay taxes, basically. Whereas if you are a working person, you're still paying your taxes.
Is there going to be anything left for Israel after all this?
Right, I know.
Where do we look? How can we approximate the size of this field?
Yeah, so it's an ongoing question. DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's been around basically since the 60s and 70s. And I think the important thing to remember is that there's no kind of federal oversight of DEI. There are no federal guidelines. There are no standards or guidelines at all. Literally anybody can be like, I'm a DEI consultant, I'm doing DEI now. So it's a vast industry that has no oversight or regulations. And what that means is it's hard to gauge exactly how much it's worth. But I think most estimates put it somewhere between $3 to $8 billion. I saw an estimate that said that by 2026, next year, it could be up to $15 billion. Again, these numbers are always in flux. But to just put that into context a little bit, the NLRB, which is the National Labor Relations Board, the federal agency that oversees workplace law, labor law and workplace issues for every workplace in the United States, their budget last year was a little under $300 million. So that gives you a sense of how vast the DEI industry is.
The copy of the book that I was reading is an uncorrected proof, and I double-checked to make sure that it wasn't a typo, that it's billion and not million. That's an incomprehensible amount of money.
Yeah.
What does that go to?
Yeah, so It's a good question. McKinsey put out this report. They found that between 2020 and 2022, like you said, corporations and the financial sector together donated a collective $340 billion to, quote, racial equity programs. That's obviously a vague thing. The McKinsey report shows that a lot of corporations donated or gave money to, quote, affordable housing and like home ownership programs. Some money went to, small businesses and entrepreneurs of color. There's a big pot of money that went to just kind of undefined other racial justice initiatives, which I'm assuming is, racial justice charities like the official Black Lives Matter organization, maybe bail funds, other racial justice charities. It's interesting, because that's kind of all the information that we have about where that money went. But I think that's part of the problem, right? That these corporations kind of came out and said, well, we're going to give all of this money to racial justice. We're going to fund racial equity. We're anti-racist now. The public had no say over where those funds went. We don't even have any way of keeping track of them.
I think a lot of people on the left assume that this current push for DEI in some ways grew out of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
In what ways is that correct or incorrect?
So DEI, I had mentioned before, does kind of begin in the 60s. It's gone through a number of evolutions and has gone by a number of different names. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was called equal opportunity compliance. But basically what happened is in 1964, the U.S. passes the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act says if you are a private sector business, you cannot discriminate anymore on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, sex. I think everybody's familiar with that from Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. However, the Civil Rights Act doesn't actually say what discrimination is and doesn't give any guidance on how corporations or how businesses should go about combating it.
How do they interpret what that means then?
Exactly. So the scholar Frank Dobbin, who has a great book called Inventing Equal Opportunity, he found that what happened was corporations were like, okay, so now we have to stay in compliance with the law. We have no guidance over how to do that. We don't even have a definition for discrimination, for affirmative action, for equal opportunity. So I guess we'll just make it up as we go along.
Oh, great. Okay.
So, I mean, so in fairness to them, they were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place where they had to comply with the law, but didn't know how to do it. But what ends up happening practically is they are allowed to kind of create the standards that they then have to comply with. And then to make things even more complicated, federal courts now have to deal with discrimination cases. They have to deal with discrimination lawsuits. But again, because there's no sort of overarching federal guidelines over that, the federal courts look to the corporations to see what they're doing and then kind of use corporate best practices to say, this is how we fight discrimination. So that's all to say that the corporate sector has always had quite a lot of jurisdiction and a lot of discretion over what counts as anti-discrimination. And so fast forward to today, that's why we have this huge amorphous thing called DEI. There's no connection to the government or really to civil rights that I can see. And it's completely to the discretion of employers.
So this, as we mentioned before, $3 to $8 billion industry. Yeah. Who does that money go to? Is that for consultants or
it's for
who are these people?
Consultants. It's for in-house DEI programs. Something that I discuss in my book is that it could also be going to union busters. These days, a lot of employer-side labor law firms kind of do double duty where they will help a company do some union busting, but at the same time, they'll also offer them a DEI package. And, often they're one and the same thing.
Discount
exactly.
If you get both?
If you bundle the two services.
Great. Did woke help to put Trump in office?
I'm sorry to say, I think it did, but perhaps not in the way that the right or the way that centrist third-way Democrats think. So over this time period, the Democrats and the Republicans have been sort of steadily converging on economics, but diverging on culture, right? So famously in the 90s, Bill Clinton takes the Democratic Party to the right economically, where he enacts welfare reform, slashes social spending, also passes NAFTA, a free trade agreement, which undermines manufacturing in the US, outsources jobs, leads to the loss of hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. He also deregulates Wall Street, the banks. He deregulates telecommunications. So that's a very neoliberal economic project, which obviously the Republicans and the right were very happy about. Fast forward to today, I think we're still definitely living with that legacy, but at the same time, the most salient differences between the Republicans and the Democrats now are not on economics, they're on culture, right? So when you think about, how the Democrats differ from the Republicans, it's on issues like abortion, race, immigration, climate change, that kind of thing. And there's a scholar at Harvard named Peter Hall who's looked at this problem, and he makes the point that there's about 20% of the electorate today that can be described as sort of economically left, but culturally conservative, or at least culturally moderate. And he's saying that because the Democrats have moved to the right on economics, but sort of remain progressive in the cultural realm, this group of the electorate just has no political party that's representing them. They have no political home. So basically you have a vacuum, right, where the only thing that's available to these voters who are economically left but perhaps culturally conservative is kind of this culture war. I think that in a lot of the polling that comes out after this last election, 2024, you can see a lot of that. The polling has shown that what were people's top issues, especially working class people, what were their top issues for the 2024 election? The economy, jobs, healthcare, kind of the same things they've always been, what we call bread and butter issues. But an interesting disjunct is the same polls find that these people, when you ask them, well, what do you think the Democrats' top priorities are? They say trans issues, climate change, the environment, abortion. And it's interesting, right? Because I think it's true that Kamala didn't really run on those things and, in fact, tried to roll back or moderate some of the cultural positions that she had been associated with before. And, of course, I think Biden tried very hard to kind of lean into the bread and butter and the economic side of his program. But I think it was too little too late, again, because of this 30-year, if not more, trajectory in which the two parties are rapidly diverging on culture, but converging on economics. And you have this part of the electorate that's sort of left out. And the culture war takes up so much oxygen in the media ecosystem. I think that explains the disjunct.
Yeah, I mean, you hear the same message for 8 years, and then 3 months before the election, they change tune. Like,
exactly.
What are you going to remember?
Yeah. And I mean, I think also about how Kamala, she didn't really have an economic message. She talked a lot about economic opportunity. I think she came up with the phrase opportunity economy, which isn't really compelling, I mean, it kind of just sounds like warmed over Barack Obama platitude. Like, what is that?
Yeah. Small business owners, or who is it intended for?
Exactly. You tell me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Black men's crypto assets will be protected.
Right. Yeah.
At least that. 20% is an enormous margin.
Yes.
There's no swing state that has a margin of 20%.
Yeah.
It's a sizable portion of the electorate.
Right.
You mentioned before NAFTA, the disappearance of manufacturing jobs. There was a phrase that was popular in the 1980s called the Reagan Democrats, of people who had historically voted for the Democrats but then chose to support Reagan.
Right.
Who did the people who used to do those manufacturing jobs end up voting for?
There are studies that show that very stable Democratic voting blocs in the industrial heartland or in the Rust Belt voted Democrat consistently up until NAFTA and then started voting Republican after NAFTA. So the de-alignment has been happening for quite a long time.
What do we mean by this term, de-alignment?
Class de-alignment is basically the phenomenon happening in the U.S. and other countries as well in Western Europe and elsewhere, where the center-left parties that used to be kind of the natural home or a pretty consistent home for working-class voters. In the U.S., it was sort of from the New Deal onward. Class de-alignment is the process where over the years, we see those voters starting to drift away. In the U.S., it's been a pretty substantive bleeding from the Democratic Party at the same time that you see more highly educated, college-educated, affluent elites coming into the party.
Trump is in office. DEI has been very influential among elite professional spheres.
Yes.
Should we consider this to be over? Is it going to experience a resurgence, or what do you make of its prospects in the next few years?
Is DEI over? I don't think that it is. At least at the time of this recording, I think it's too soon to say. I know a lot of people, liberals and progressives are kind of worried and see Trump's attacks. And I've heard people say this is the end of DEI as we know it. DEI has a very long history, or what we now call DEI today, workplace initiatives meant to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's had a long history in the U.S. It has undergone many different evolutions, many different names, but it's always been here, right? At least since the 60s and 70s. I should mention under Reagan, Reagan was another Republican president who was very hostile to the idea of, back then it was just called affirmative action or, diversity or equal opportunity. Right. He was very hostile to that. He cut the EEOC, as lots of people know. He appointed Clarence Thomas to head up the EEOC to preside over this hollowed out agency. And he openly declared war on affirmative action. What did we see during that time? Diversity management grew in a way at a rate that it probably hasn't until 2020, right? Wow. So the corporate sector was basically like, we see that Reagan is doing this, but we're not going to do what he says. In fact, we're going to continue building out our diversity management because we like it. Wow. So, that's all to say, again, to go back to the earlier point about how DEI and civil rights aren't as closely linked as people think they are. Business interests have a lot of reasons to hang on to DEI, so I think they will. Obviously, we've seen a lot of headlines about how certain big companies are rolling back some of their DEI programs. Target, of course, I think has come under fire recently because it publicly said that it's going to roll back some of its DEI programs. But I think for every company that has said they're going to roll back DEI, there's another company that has said, no, we're going to stand firm and we're going to continue doing DEI. So with Target, for example, Costco was like, we're going to keep doing DEI. And, then, of course, people, including Al Sharpton, were like, that's great. We should buy everything from Costco. Oh, great. And then I should also point out that, those are just the companies that have publicly made statements on DEI. Every Fortune 500 company has a DEI office, DEI officers, some sort of DEI programs in place. We haven't heard from most of them. We don't know what they're going to do. My gut says that they're probably going to keep those programs in some form. They might change the name. DEI, it's starting to get kind of that Trumpian ring. People might be shying away from that term, but people are already moving to new terms.
Yeah, we're calling it belonging now.
We are, yeah. DEIB, sometimes just belonging. I've seen JEDI, JEDI, justice.
Like Star Wars?
Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So,
they couldn't rearrange those to be something besides, okay.
Listen, Josh, I'm only telling you what I've seen.
You're reporting from in the field. Yes. Yeah. This connection between civil rights and DEI, this kind of like faulty lineage, I think it's actually a bit worse than that. That there are a lot of people who come from the right anyway, that will make this argument about something called cultural Marxism, that the corporations that are now deploying this type of diversity, equity, inclusion rhetoric, this workplace discipline, are the inheritors of a Marxist vanguard.
Yeah.
What do you make of this idea, this connection between Marxism and DEI?
I always have to laugh when I hear charges of Marxism being leveled at the U.S., which is the country with the highest rates of inequality, poverty, the weakest labor protections in the industrialized world. If there's Marxism here, please show me. I don't really see any of it myself. But yes, what these right-wingers are referring to is it's a school of thought that has sort of bubbled up on the right over the past couple of years. And it's this idea that wokeness and DEI and, basically any kind of social justice excess that they don't like is something called cultural Marxism, which we have inherited as a society from the Frankfurt School in the post-war period. So the Frankfurt School, of course, a group of German immigrants, philosophers who come to the U.S. after World War II, and famously, build a school of what they call critical theory. They are Marxists, yes, but I think what is important to remember is that their Marxism isn't really like the orthodox class struggle Marxism that I think, the right maybe wants to think that it is. But rather they bring a new critique where they say, we have to think about why the class revolution hasn't happened. We have to look at culture. We have to look at the culture industry. We have to look at people's racial attitudes to figure out why people willingly participate in the capitalist system and why no revolution has happened, right? Like, how are people brainwashed, or why do people buy into this system? And interestingly, I think that is the part of the Frankfurt School that has remained most influential. So not really the Marxist part, but the part that says we need an explanation other than economics to figure out what's going on in society. That definitely influences the New Left at the time. So you see, youth movements and student movements and
the SDS.
SDS, yep. Weathermen, people on the left who are kind of excited about the possibility of a new vanguard, right? Comprised of the world's most oppressed, which includes, third world revolutionaries, but I guess also college students. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But let them have it.
Let them have it. Yeah. But
they're not going to do anything. So,
yeah. But that was kind of the idea, right? That there would be, it was kind of like, well, this idea of the old workers movement, well, they're kind of white men in hard hats. And, at worst, they're the labor aristocracy. They've been bought off by the fruits of imperialism and living in the first world. So we need a new vanguard of the most oppressed, the most marginalized, right? And I think you can see the ways that still influences the left today. So that's all to say that I think that in a weird way, the right-wingers are sort of right that the Frankfurt School has an influence on today.
Yes.
But again, I think that it's more of the turn away from, the notion of the traditional working class as the subject of history, and instead this focus on, what we might call the more marginalized groups.
You mentioned the hard hats. Should we give a citation for where that comes from? You're talking about the Hard Hat Rebellion, I think.
The hard hat, hard hat riots of the 70s.
That isn't familiar with that, what is the struggle between these student protesters and the construction workers?
Yeah, so it's interesting. This happened under the Nixon administration, and it kind of famously, is remembered, I think, in the popular imagination as these student protesters being attacked by these construction workers, these hard hats for protesting the Vietnam War. And the enduring, I think, trope that comes out of this moment is this idea of the hard hat, the white working class male as this kind of reactionary, violent, Archie Bunker type voter, this backward, I guess you could say economically, I don't know about economically left, but, very culturally conservative, this backwards, aggressive macho trope that we should get rid of and consign to the dustbin of history and instead, turn our sights to the more enlightened portions of the working class.
Yeah, this idea kind of emerges around that time that the students, often from these elite backgrounds, are opposed to the war. The working class is economically and culturally backwards, and they're in favor of the war. They support imperialism.
Right.
They're also a labor aristocracy. They're bought off by the privileges of the first world.
Yeah.
And there's a subsequent study by the Ehrenreichs, I believe, that actually kind of turns that thesis on its head, that overwhelmingly, disproportionately, it was working class people who opposed the war. Their children were sent to die. And the elites were in favor.
Right.
So I hear you on this polarization of wealth.
Yeah.
But people often argue now that we have closed the gap between black and white wealth accumulation in the U.S., that we're actually making progress towards racial justice by closing that gap. How do you understand these numbers of the accumulation of black versus white wealth in the United States?
Yeah, it gets a little sticky. I think when people talk about the racial wealth gap, I have some sympathy for that because, again, I think that they are trying to talk about material concerns and they're trying to talk about the redistribution of wealth. But something that's important to remember is Matt Bruenig at the People's Policy Project, he crunched the numbers on the racial wealth gap a while back. And he, or should I say the People's Policy Project, found something interesting, which is that because wealth in America is so skewed toward the 1%, basically the bottom 50% of the wealth distribution in the country, whether it's black or white, have basically no wealth at all, right? So when you talk about closing the racial wealth gap, what ends up happening if you don't first close the gap between the rich and the poor of any race is you kind of just end up making Black people richer. I mean, he crunches the numbers and shows that 80%, almost 80% of the racial wealth gap could be closed by making rich Black people richer. And I don't think that's what people have in mind when they talk about closing the racial wealth gap.
It may be what some people have in mind, actually.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. In the intro to the book, you talk about some of the history of anti-racism, particularly in 1948. How far back does this thing go?
I think when we're talking about how far back anti-racism goes, it maybe makes sense to specifically say what we mean by racism and anti-racism.
Yeah.
So I think there's a kind of popular colloquial understanding of racism that, if you went out on the street and asked most people, they would probably give you this definition of racism. And it's the definition of racism as interpersonal prejudice, right? Like discrimination, bias, treating somebody differently based on how, their ascriptive racial identity or the color of their skin or how they look, or, people being confined to second-class citizenship because of the color of their skin or their racial identity. So that's kind of, the popular working definition of racism. And anti-racism obviously would just be opposing those things, which is great. Actually, that's all well and fine and good, and that's the thing that goes back to the Enlightenment. I think that we should treat everybody with colorblind equality. We shouldn't consign people to second-class citizenship based on the color of their skin or anything else they can't control. However, we have heard from the left and from progressives over the last several decades that this is not a good definition of racism, right? Like this idea that racism is interpersonal. No. We should move away from that definition of racism, and instead we should think of racism, again, as something that is systemic or structural, right?
Okay.
Like I was saying before, I am somewhat sympathetic to that move. I'm sure I myself have uttered some version of that sentiment at one point in my life or another. And the reason I'm sympathetic is because it feels like a way to move away from talking about like what's in people's minds and hearts and instead talking about material things, right? Like we want to redistribute some wealth. We want to make sure everybody has good jobs in healthcare. And that's all well and good. But the problem with thinking about anti-racism and racism in this way is then you go back to the problem of talking about disparities. You go back to talking about racial disparities. And I think when you sort of fixate on these racial disparities, again, you kind of come to the wrong solutions, right? Like you start going down the road of, oh, well, if it's structural racism causing these racial disparities, then we need to address historical racism, or we need to do something special instead of these universal, social democratic reforms that I keep talking about. I mean, a good example is you've probably seen that, the Black maternal mortality rate in the U.S. is much higher than the white maternal mortality rate, although I will say that the maternal mortality rate in the U.S. for any race is higher than it is for any other industrialized nation, again, because of a lack of a healthcare system. But the reason why I think the Black maternal mortality rate has gotten a lot of attention in recent years is because often you'll hear people say something like, well, Black women with a college degree are actually dying in childbirth at a higher rate than white women with only a high school degree. So that's proof that it isn't just class. There's something called structural racism that's going on here. This is, there's hundreds of articles that you can find that make this claim. Like, see, it's structural racism. It isn't class. It's something else. Clearly something's going on, right? However, if you look at these articles, you'll also see that after, they go through explaining that this can't be class, it's structural racism, something unique is going on here, then they get to the part about what to do about it, and they all say, we need more Black doctors and more Black doulas. And maybe we do, I mean, I don't know, who could argue with that? We probably do, but those don't seem very structural.
Why do people think that DEI is left-wing?
I think people think it's left-wing because, especially in recent years, it has used a lot of left-wing language. Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw famously says during the racial reckoning, every corporation worth its salt is now saying something about structural racism and anti-Blackness, and this is even outpacing what Bernie Sanders is saying, right? So, but if you look at the statements that come out during that time period, they are indistinguishable from corporations. They are indistinguishable from what you see coming out of activist NGOs. Corporations really are talking about structural racism and anti-Blackness and, in some cases, decolonization. What that means to them is a completely different story, but you do see this language. And I think that a lot of DEI professionals will also use this language now. And I think that, it does give these activities a kind of left-wing sheen.
Let's assume that people, they don't think that DEI is a left-wing idea. But they do, in some cases, think that DEI is a co-optation of left-wing ideas.
Yeah.
Is it?
It's an interesting question. I do know that a lot of progressives really like that framework. I'm not crazy about it myself, to be honest, and there's a few reasons. So, number one, I think when you say that corporations co-opted radical anti-racism to do these DEI programs, I think sometimes the implication is that, after George Floyd was killed, there was this wave of massive protests across the country, right? Mass uprising, millions of people flooded the streets. And then corporations saw that and got scared and thought, wow, we better co-opt this energy, or we better, sign on to this somehow. It seems like people are really upset. We better do something to make it seem like we're on the right side of history.
They thought the pitchforks were coming for them.
Exactly. So I think that is part of what's at the heart of the co-optation argument. But if you go back and you look at the timeline, that's not really what happened. What happened was the protests were happening and corporations were making their statements and rolling out these massive sums of money at exactly the same time, right? These things happen concurrently. So you can't really make the case, I don't think, that, there was a mass uprising and then corporations were scared of the pitchforks and then they were like, okay, we better release all these statements. So that's one thing. Another thing is, I think that the line between so-called corporate anti-racism and radical, authentic, pure grassroots anti-racism is often not as hard as people think it is. A lot of corporations in 2020 and afterwards expressed support for, things like reparations. There were corporate leaders who said, yes, we need to, have $14 trillion of reparations go to Black Americans who had ancestors who were enslaved. We saw tons of blue chip corporations like Google, Apple, big banks, Meta, I think, sign on to a petition calling on the Supreme Court to not overturn affirmative action in higher education. These corporations said, we really support affirmative action. We love having affirmative action in higher education. This is what helps us, get a diverse workforce, because obviously we need the best people from the Ivy League schools, right? And we need them to be diverse. And so you saw, again, both corporate America and a lot of grassroots and civil rights groups kind of converging on the same thing. And then the final thing is just what we were talking about earlier. So much money went into these racial equity measures in the wake of 2020 that it's hard for me to call that a co-optation. I mean, $340 billion, it's hard to see that as a co-optation. I think, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money and resources that went to, so-called racial equity. And I think finally I'll say that even if you don't buy all of that and you think, corporations, no, it was co-optation, corporations somehow, were able to hijack all of this grassroots energy, I think the question that still arises is, why was it so easy for them to hijack or to co-opt this supposedly grassroots movement, right?
Why was it so easy?
Yeah, why were they able to do it from the very beginning? And I think, again, the answer that you kind of come back to is that there was something palatable about that moment for them, or there was some way in which it was compatible with their own interests.
There's an important example I like to cite back from 2020 where there were various proposals for reparations from many of the Democratic candidates. I mean, you remember we had this whole field of 20 different people in the race.
Each with their own reparations policy,
A
except for
whole
Bernie
different,
Sanders.
Incredibly, I mean, just baroque, esoteric, like complex small business owners who happen to own crypto, who had a felony conviction for marijuana or like whatever.
Yeah.
All of them resulted in less wealth redistribution than Bernie's universal policies.
Of course.
Every single one. Why do corporations like the idea of reparations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that corporations and a lot of politicians, especially Democratic politicians, like the idea of reparations and or race-targeted measures, exactly because of what you just said, that it actually costs less money in the long run than something that is a universal sweeping reform like Medicare for all. I think that it sounds good. It sounds progressive, right? It sounds like you're really taking into consideration these historical injustices and you're doing the right thing and you're serving the most disadvantaged of, the various racial groups. But politicians have been doing this for a long time. It's called means testing. Usually or in the past, it's been, well, only people below a certain income cutoff get these benefits. These policies end up becoming really unpopular and divisive. It's really hard. I mean, especially with the race stuff, I think it's really hard to tell people who are struggling, well, no, you don't get this benefit because you're not the right race to qualify. They're really politically unpopular. And that makes them pretty weak, I think. It makes them not durable. And again, I think it limits the size and the scope of what these redistributive projects could be.
Is there something that's convenient about these type of reparation policy proposals that to kind of head fake at progressive politics? In a majoritarian democracy, you propose something that would benefit just a few people, you strategically overreach, you exaggerate the degree to which you want to help someone, and it can never pass, but at least you made the proposal.
I think there's got to be some element of that. I mean, literally this happens every time, right? There's especially since 2020, there's a big outcry about, reparations. Like, for example, in California, like, oh, we created this task force to study the issue of reparations. That's gone nowhere for years. The task force will advance a certain proposal and it'll get a lot of media attention. And to be clear, again, I don't know if the task force is doing this on purpose. I think that they actually probably do want to see something, get across the finish line, but they'll propose things like direct cash payments. And of course, we know that's not going to go anywhere. A while back, they threw this idea of free tuition for Black students in California. That's not going to go anywhere. Obviously, the tuition is rising for everybody in California. We have a major student debt crisis. College is unaffordable. Like, how are you going to say, oh, we're only going to give free tuition to a select few students, right? So yeah, I do think that there is a little bit of a vicious cycle where, these ideas will come up and everybody knows that there isn't much. I mean, it'll be really difficult to implement any of them. If they are implemented, I mean, we've seen this happen with race-targeted measures before. Probably the right wing will challenge those policies legally, and then you're kind of back. You are mired in this expensive legal fight, and then you're back to square one. So,
yeah, I mean, if you rolled back the clock, 100 years, and you told me that the political left would be arguing about a state-enforced definition of race, right-wingers at the time would be like, "Oh, fuck, we won.
Yeah,
how'd this work?"
Exactly. Yeah.
But seriously, who qualifies for this? Like, what is a state-accepted definition of being any racial group?
Well, I know. And that's, it goes back to what I was saying about means testing earlier, that, part of why means tested programs are weak and so fragile is because it requires a lot of administrative bureaucracy and it requires a lot of jumping through hoops to prove that you have you are qualified for this program. And a lot of people get discouraged and drop out, or a lot of people, file the wrong paperwork and don't qualify. And it's kind of the same with the race, with reparations or any other sort of racial means targeting. How do you determine who qualifies? You could spend years having that conversation. People are spending years having that conversation when it comes to reparations. Again, to go back to California, I don't think this will happen, but I think I saw, one of the people on the task force being like, well, maybe we could do DNA tests. And and back to what you were saying about, being 100 years ago.
This person works in the government?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was just an idea that was thrown out there. I mean, but again,
why
it's
don't
like,
we measure their skulls while we're at it?
I know. I said the same thing.
Great. If you could pass one piece of legislation to close the life expectancy gap, to close the racial wealth gap, what would that be?
Medicare for all. Next.
Why?
Medicare for all is, or should I say single-payer healthcare, would be the single most transformative policy for the U.S. And the reason for that is because, obviously, our healthcare system is insane. I mean, I don't think you and I need to spend much time talking about the reasons why that is. Everybody knows at this point. It's insane. It's expensive. It makes no sense whatsoever. Everybody hates it.
I've read the manifesto.
It locks people out of the healthcare system. It immiserates millions. At the same time, because our system is an employer-based healthcare system, it also locks people into jobs, right? So I'm sure you personally or people who have kept working at shitty jobs because they needed the healthcare,
right,
or who would have preferred to, be a freelancer or whatever, but got a desk job so they could have healthcare. You can have employer-sponsored healthcare and yet still be totally bankrupt by one unexpected medical emergency. Employers receive tax breaks for giving their employees healthcare, and I'm not sure if everybody knows that. It's not a lot, but there are lots of reasons why employers, even sometimes people ask, well, why don't employers support Medicare for all? Because then they wouldn't have to pay for healthcare.
Right.
But they get a tax break for offering healthcare, and two, it keeps their workforce locked in.
Oh, they're more hesitant to leave.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The stakes are much higher.
Right. Bad working conditions. You're like, well, I'm not going to leave because I need to go to the doctor.
Exactly.
Yeah. In 2016, a lot of this rhetoric started when there was a proposal, a gentle proposal, nothing intended seriously, nationalizing the banks. We were told that this would not solve racism. What impact would nationalizing the banks have on the racial wealth gap?
Yes. Yes, Hillary Clinton famously on the campaign trail as a dig at Bernie says, breaking up the big banks won't end racism. Well, it was her husband who deregulated the banks in the first place, which of course, as we well know, led to the subprime mortgage crisis and the 2008 financial crash, which devastated Black household wealth. Black and, Latino households, I think, were disproportionately hit by the financial crash and were evicted or had their homes foreclosed on. So I think that regulating the banks early on, continuing to regulate the banks would have prevented this catastrophic economic disaster, which obviously was much more catastrophic for the Black and brown working class than, I don't know, Hillary Clinton saying that we need to fight racism.
Yeah, the stats are rarely calculated in this fashion, but I think to go back again to Matt Brunick's work, the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis was quantitatively the greatest destruction of Black and brown wealth in American history.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Enlightenment before. This is a rather fraught topic.
Yes.
In the last few years, maybe for quite a bit longer. People in elite universities, institutions tend to make these criticisms that the Enlightenment is responsible for slavery, colonialism, these types of historical tragedies. How should the left consider its relationship to the Enlightenment?
I'm a fan of the Enlightenment. I strongly believe that the left should consider itself the proud and rightful inheritor of the Enlightenment tradition and Enlightenment values. Every significant, left revolution or left movement, almost every significant left movement for the past 100, maybe 200 years has drawn from Enlightenment values. The Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. All of those movements, all of those revolutions are indebted to Enlightenment values, upheld Enlightenment values. Same with the civil rights movement in the U.S. So I know the line of critique that you're talking about, but it just doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would you throw out all of that just because, Kant is European or something?
That's well, I think there's not a real canon that people study now.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think generally, I was talking about this with Catherine before, but there's people who are educated of our generation get these tertiary and secondary sources, and they probably haven't read the primary source material. And so the way that you found upward mobility within those institutions was making criticisms of the canon that came before you.
Oh,
And
yes.
that was the type of lineage, passing of the
Yeah.
baton that they were involved in.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think we're due for a pro-Enlightenment wave of academics?
Well, this is, I mean, most people don't get this deep because they just, similar to the right-wing stuff, like they've just never seen these spaces, right?
Yeah,
But there are, organized, well-capitalized movements now that are advocating for theocracy, literally fucking monarchy. That's what they describe it as. People make arguments for the caste system and all of these anti-Enlightenment, dark Enlightenment ideologies. And then you have a left which refuses to take inheritance for rationality and reason, and is also maybe incapable in some cases of making arguments that stand up to critiques. And so, we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot before we can even engage in the debate. And so I think that is the thing to be deliberated among people on the left, is like what to take in terms of inheritance from the Enlightenment. Is it a complete project? Is it done? Do you abandon it? And it just seems like a very kind of like convenient within the framework of cultural institutions to be like, this stuff is bad. I dismiss it. I don't need the canon who came before me. And essentially what they're arguing for there is not like a kind of lineage or a kind of like a certain scaffolding of scholarship and ideas on top of one another, but they're saying that the people who are in the superior positions within my institution need to be ousted so I can get a promotion. That is the effect in their workplaces. But once the left...
So my question for you again is, once those people get a promotion, is there going to be a new wave of scholars who wants to oust them by bringing the Enlightenment back?
Well, I think that there's a life cycle to institutions, and a lot of the ones we have now are just completely rotten. That's why social media is interesting now. It's not that social media has a better design than the institutions, or that we should, favor this kind of exitarian impulse to just do all of our discourse on Substack and YouTube or whatever. But just like the deep political rot in the institutions is basically unfixable right now. You need another generational life cycle. Like anything else, a magazine is relevant and interesting for a certain period, and then it gets captured by certain interests, and so you start another one. But we're going through that with basically our humanities, our scholarship, our higher education right now. So I'm in favor of liquidating all of them.
Yeah, it sounds great. I agree.
A giant archipelago of Substack, and we'll do that for about 10 years, and then we can make a new
Something else will come along.
Yeah. I would say that a lot of the left-wing politics that we're used to talking about now are very much inflected with a kind of libertarianism.
Definitely.
And that would come, I think we both agree, comes from this 68 generation.
Yes, this kind of spirit of anti-authoritarianism.
Right, which inevitably turns into a kind of individualism, small business politics, voluntary transactions. A lot of those ideas, this kind of horizontalism, has, I would say, become manifest in social media now. Do you see a kind of through line to the politics that are being litigated on today's social media, taking some form of inheritance from this new left?
What are the politics being litigated on social media?
Anti-hierarchical politics, discussions that should happen privately in literally disciplinary hearings within socialist organizations that are then posted to posted to social media. Those kinds of things come to mind. Have we talked about Fred Turner before?
I don't think so.
Okay, he wrote this book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, which is a group of people who go out in the 60s and 70s to make the communes in California, and they're very much like, everybody here is equal, no one is a leader or whatever. They refuse to create any type of disciplinary hierarchy, what have you. People tend to think of that as somehow being socialist or on the left or whatever. Those same groups, as soon as the communes fail, I mean, surprise, surprise, you can't grow your own food, and somebody's got to be in charge of something. They move back to literally Silicon Valley. They found all of these tech companies. These people build the early infrastructure of networks, communication networks on the internet. And so they find a way to kind of like structurally realize the type of politics that they had in the commune. This the very reduced, boiled down version of Turner's argument.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, we tend to think of those like that hippie counterculture as being somehow the inheritance of the left.
Right.
And I kind of understand them as libertarian individualists who wanted to do polycule stuff or whatever they're doing. But that type of organization, if you just look at the even plane of social media, that everyone as one individual gets to participate in this network diagram, it feels very structurally similar. You know, small is beautiful type of politics.
Right, yeah.
And so I have this idea that what we have mistaken as the left that emerged in the late 60s, those people actually won.
Yeah.
And we're now playing out their politics in literally the diagrams that they designed on the networks that they own.
Yeah.
And we somehow think we're doing revolution, right?
Right.
So everybody comes out to do this mass, leaderless, disorganized protest that has no fucking demands. Or at least their demands are so hysterical they don't expect them to actually be met.
Right.
And you like, I don't know, break a bunch of shop windows and don't ask for anything. And it's like, you couldn't have designed, you know, a better opponent if someone you wanted to fight. And I think that has to do with, you know, I am really media driven in my analysis.
Yeah.
I think a lot of what we're talking about in a previous generation would not have risen to the level of politics and is a media phenomena that has now kind of usurped the position of politics in society. But that history from Fred Turner actually, I think, goes a long way to explain it. So I bring
the
up these
hippies definitely
topics.
won because they became neoliberals.
They did.
Yeah.
Right.
And, you know, a lot of people point out that there is a convergence between kind of the anti-authoritarian spirit of the hippie era that you were talking about and free market values. I mean, you know, the free market ideology also values anti-authoritarianism, horizontalism, flexibility, the rhizome, you know? So there is a kind of strange convergence between those two things. I think Nancy Fraser has called it progressive neoliberalism. Other people call it, you know, multicultural neoliberalism. But basically, it's this idea that you can be libertarian in both economics and culture. And I think we see that all the time.
Right. But they don't know it's libertarianism.
I
asked Catherine about this. Like, should we define socialism and anarchism? Because I don't think most people understand that those things are different. They're like, oh, yeah, Kropotkin, like it's the same stuff, like anarcho-communism, whatever they think. I don't know. They spend a lot of time on the internet. They've not actually read the books. But a lot of those ideas have just become mistaken, like Indiana Jones, where he's changing out the bag of sand for the idol.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
They just mistake one for the other.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I mean, a lot in recent years, as I'm sure you've noticed, a lot of people have been speculating about whether, quote, wokeness is over or whether wokeness is dying. And I think it's actually a pretty difficult thing to measure because part of it, as you just said, is this. Exactly. It's like this vanguardist aspect, you know? So The Economist actually did a pretty interesting study recently where they were like, let's try to quantify wokeness and see, you know, whether it's peaked and fallen. And so they looked at things like university.
Are we at peak woke?
They had determined that we have passed peak woke.
We're past peak woke.
Yeah, but here, okay, so this is what their study said. So they were like, we're going to measure all of these different things like university policies. You know, we're going to see how many academics get censured for their beliefs. We're going to measure the prevalence of certain words that appear in the popular literature, like intersectionality and oppression and stuff like that. And what they found was that things, you know, by their measures, things obviously peaked around 2020, 2021, and then they began to drop. So wokeness, according to their measures, has been on the decline since 2021. The caveat is that wokeness today, by their measures, is still higher than it was in 2015, like way higher.
Whoa,
so it's like, okay, I guess it peaked. I guess we're over peak woke, but we're still at like pretty high plateau woke.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, especially when I was looking at their list of words like intersectionality and oppression, it's like, those are almost outdated at this point, right?
Yeah,
like if you're woke, you're onto something. I mean, I'm not saying you don't use those words, but like I'm sure you've come up with the next thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably like Bitcoin, where if you like look at the peak in 2011, it's like, wow, it really crashed. But actually, it's just way higher now, you know?
Right, yeah.
Vivek was saying, and I think he's probably right about this, that although, like, let's say a popular audience gets like sick of some of the rhetoric and like the different, you're not supposed to say this, you got to say that.
Yeah.
There's basically no mechanism in these elite institutions to stop it.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And there's
yeah,
actually
yeah.
active rewards for people in a lot of
Exactly.
those
Yeah,
fields.
that's the other
And so
thing.
I don't think
yeah.
it's going to go, we're going to have Trump for 4 years and then it'll
Yeah.
be somebody else. But like the general idea of like a hyper focus onto identity to displace the class struggle is like,
Yeah.
that's not going away.
I don't think so. And, if you are normal people sick of woke? Certainly. But
Right.
like you said, people in elite institutions, I think, are going to hang on to it, for dear life.
Sometimes you'll get a criticism from people on the left that like, okay, yeah, this stuff is annoying. Yeah, it's in the way of the class project.
Yeah.
But it's like a hobby horse that you always return to. And like, maybe it's actually not that important. Like there's something else to be doing. And I kind of feel right now that actually,
Oh, like, why are you spending so much time complaining about wokeness? It's not a big
right,
deal. Like, yeah, it's stupid, but just let it go.
relitigating these like abstract theoretical ideas, I think actually the problem is like so deep
Yeah.
that like we have to do a total rebuild of what people even think socialist politics is right
I agree.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's really important to talk about like one, because it is, to say like the quiet part loud, it is the most effective form of recruitment for downwardly mobile white working class men or
Yeah,
who were
of
previously
course.
middle class to working class.
Yeah.
If you're concerned about a rising fascist movement in the United States, like fascism is the middle class run amok without the ability to express their economic woes through organization.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about this thing, diffusing the primary means of recruitment and folding
Yeah.
those people into
Pretty
an organized
important.
labor movement, like
Yeah.
that is basically the task right now,
Mhm,
right? Like
mhm.
impossible. I'm paraphrasing from you as I do on many other podcasts, but it's impossible to not notice that across the advanced world, there's this rising right-wing populism
Mhm.
that historically the constituencies that voted for labor are now drifting towards this nationalist right.
Right.
Like that is the single clearly demonstrated trend across the entire advanced world.
Right.
Fucking talk about it. Like this is the important thing.
Right.
And it just seems like impossible to bring that up, right? It's actually, I think it's verboten for people who are in left-wing groups to imagine that anyone could be persuaded to think differently.
Right. Right.
Despite the overwhelming, just like impossible to ignore amount of evidence that this is the trend that's happening.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
they have to kind of imagine themselves in the shoes of someone who would make that leap. And for them, it's personally impossible, right?
Right, right.
Because they have, whatever certain moral, philosophical positions, but
Yeah.
like they just don't step outside of their world, so they don't notice it.
Right.
And so, I mean, it feels a little bit like crass. It gets a little bit annoying. It's like, oh, we got to do this hobby horse of like the woke stuff again.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, it's like, this is the book, right? This is like the book that talks about this contemporary phenomena rather than maybe, I would think of Adolf Reed as giving you the kind of like historical argument that leads up to now.
Yeah.
But this is the analysis of what's happening now,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that book, it literally, as we're recording this conversation, it hasn't even come out yet.
Right. Yes.
So to publicly make these arguments is part of the project right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big project ahead of us.
It is. Yeah.
Welcome back to the podcast. We just did a whole other episode that will be on the private feed. Jen Pan, your book, Selling Social Justice, is out on May 6th.
Yes.
May 6th from Verso Books. If you like this program, I strongly encourage you to support Jen's book. You are maybe the most influential podcaster for me. I literally pull my questions for interviews from stuff you did on the Jacobin channel years ago. So thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, Josh.